The End and the Death Part 3 is beyond anything I imagined it would be. An incredible piece of writing for sure, and an epic end to one of the greatest sci-fi story arcs of all time, the Horus Heresy and the Siege of Terra. But it was brutal. And I mean, it was like the fight between Horus and Sanguinius in terms of brutality, but it just kept going and going and going. Like the meme that South Park used in their Cripple Fight episode, the fight between Rowdy Roddy Piper and Keith David in John Carpenter's documentary film They Live, this is like watching someone get kicked in the balls over and over for hours on end. At a certain point I was like, okay, that's gotta be it. This should be wrapping up any time now. And it just kept pounding on like the Energizer Bunny. And I, for one, being the sadomasochist that I am, loved every glorious minute of it. So, in my typical fashion, I'm going to go through and look at the fight, the end, and the death. The last episode of this series ended with the Emperor and his boarding party teleporting off to the Vengeful Spirit to face Horus. That is where we will continue from. So Horus had lowered the shields on the Vengeful Spirit, taunting the Emperor to come face him. He knows he's torqued up, absolutely Arnoldarian in proportion to his regular demigod self, drunk on the juice of all four of the Chaos Gods, and he knows that the Emperor is no match for him. But the War Master also knows that Guilliman is only 9 hours away from arriving at Terra. The Lion and Russ are on the way too. He knows it's now or never, it's all or nothing. But the Emperor took the bait and went to end it all. One thing we learn is that he knew what the outcome was likely to be, and yet he went to face his fate anyway. Now, I did a video on Sanguinius and his battle with Horus and how Games Workshop massively changed it. So if you've seen that, you'll know what I'm talking about. But the Emperor let the Great Angel come along on the boarding action for the same reason he went as well. Sanguinius shared his vision of his own death at the hands of Horus with his father, and so the Emperor, realizing that the angel was trying to do the exact same thing he himself was doing, trying to change fate, allowed his son to go. Now, they didn't just teleport up to the Vengeful Spirit and start wrecking face. They got scattered. And by scattered, I mean thrust into different dimensions, warp pockets, and strange places. Rogel Dorn ended up in an infinite desert, being tempted by Khorne for perceived centuries. Valdor was scattered away from the Emperor. Sanguinius was first to face Horus. So let's dive into what happened, and while it is neither pretty nor surprising, it is actually quite a bit different than the lore that has existed for decades. Or rather, the lore on the lore, as the final fight had never actually been covered until the Siege of Terra series came up to the end, with The End and the Death 3. Big E hits the ground running, and I mean, he's in a hangar aboard the Vengeful Spirit, and he's got the entire length of the ship to go through until he gets to Horus at the Lupercal's court. Big E just walks through fire, literally, like an absolute boss, like the master of mankind and like the pissed off dad of the guy whose ass he's on his way to beat. Just nothing breaks his stride. Now, some very telling, terrible, and intense things happened as the Emperor walked, chest puffed out. Nothing, literally nothing, standing in his way. He had to kill his Custodes after Horus was able to corrupt them, and that made him really mad. He battled demons and chaos forces. He restored his Custodes to life. He drank in the power of the warp, and stood on the threshold of becoming the 5th Chaos God, fully knowing that it would give him the power to defeat Horus. And he drank in the life force of his own Custodes. Wow, those guys had it rough in this. Kaikaltis Dusk was protected from the dark force the Emperor was becoming, a ball of darkness roiling with lightning, the Dark King, because Malcador the Sigillite had marked his breastplate with a sigil that somehow protected him, some ancient magic. But after a really old friend came to him and appeared in that key moment, in fact the Emperor's oldest friend, the Perpetual whose name literally means old person, he was talked into shedding the mantle of the Dark King. Olanius Person was able to convince Big E that if what he was doing was for humanity, then he needed to do it as a man, not as a god. Well-intentioned or not, mankind did not need a 5th Chaos God to contend with. I mean, there was a lot of reasoning, but ultimately the Emperor knew that Person was right. He shed the Dark King aspect and did not ascend to godhood, to the relief of Malkdor, who was sitting in absolute agony on the golden throne, holding it down like the hero he was eventually to be known as. Even though he wasn't assured to win anymore, the Emperor knew that facing Horus as the master of mankind was the only legit way, despite becoming a god must have been very tempting. But the Emperor had to cut off a huge chunk of himself to shed the Dark King, and he gave up his compassion and love, basically had to become totally emotionless and psychopathic just to even attempt the mission ahead. But he walks on with the proconsul of the Custodes, Kaikaltis Dusk. Eventually Leetu and Garbiel Loken join his posse, and Loken is probably my absolute favorite Astarte of all time, up there with Salt Harvitz and Nathaniel Garo. They fight on and on and on, and the Emperor refuses to be impeded. Nothing can even slow him down. He just strides on forward, just mowing everything down in his path. And eventually, as the Emperor is walking through the ship, Constantine Valdor is fighting the Justaran Terminators, the elite of the Sons of Horus under First Captain Abaddon. Dorn eventually makes it out of the desert by being more stubborn than even Khorne can handle. It was literally like trying to convince an anvil of the principles of calculus for the Blood God. The great angel Sanguinius is horrifically slain by the War Master Horus Lupercal, and one of the most gruesome splatterpunk scenes ever written. And the Blood Angels go totally mad with the Black Rage as the death of the angel sweeps across the Vengeful Spirit and Terra, like a hurricane of javelins slamming into the Blood Angels and destroying their sanity. Big E knows it, Big E feels it, and he doesn't care. He cannot care. He cut that part of himself away to keep from becoming a warpaholic, as Horus would later call him, most hypocritically. The Emperor knows that he should hurt, that the loss of the angel should at least strike him as hard as wrecking a new car or his house burning down, but there's nothing. And he can then face his wayward son Horus. This battle is so different than I thought it was going to go. It was delivered mostly from the perspective of Horus Lupercal, talking to himself in second person, analytically. He's assessing events even as they unfold, and he is cold, calculating, and in absolute terror. He's more like something from a cosmic horror, the dark god who thinks he's still a man, than a video game end boss like he used to feel like before they fleshed this out. Big E and his posse roll up into Horus's crib, taking in the corruption of the Lupercal's court. And it is quite a scene, as Horus has strung up the absolutely desecrated, smashed, skull-shattered, contorted, broken, bloodied body of Sanguinius like a trophy, a mockery, a taunt to his father, a boast, and a promise. Horus wants to talk. He wants to explain all he has done and why he is right and his father is wrong. Horus wants to seriously have a long monologue that he personally feels will let the Emperor see that he is indeed so justified in his actions, and the Emperor so wrong in his own actions, that the Master of Mankind will practically beg for Horus to end him just because he messed everything up so badly and betrayed everyone, especially his Primarch sons and the Space Marines, etc. Horus literally wants to have some daddy issue therapy session and get healed on an emotional level as a prelude to bashing his father's skull in with Worldbreaker. The Emperor just stares right through his son, right past him, and brings his gaze to meet the big four who stand behind Horus, the gods of chaos. And he just keeps saying the same thing over and over, really getting Horus hot under the collar and bringing up his blood pressure. He keeps saying, "You have killed my son." And if you listen to the audiobook version, the narration is so top-notch, and this line is delivered so well, it's kind of chilling. Horus thinks that the Emperor is talking to him, and thinks that the Emperor is referring to Sanguinius. And being the narcissist he is, he cannot see the truth of it, cannot see that he is not the most important thing going on here. Horus only sees his father looking at what he assumes is him. And when he keeps responding with these really long-winded, bloviated speeches, and his father just keeps saying the same one line over and over, "You have killed my son," Horus about loses it. I mean, some of his rants were just completely pedantic. I mean, they were nearly encyclopedic, just blowing hot air up his own ass for minutes on end. And trust me, there's nothing that gets to a narcissist worse than just completely ignoring them. It takes him A very uncomfortable amount of time before he realizes that the Emperor is not talking to him, but about him, to the Big Four, to Nurgle, Tzeentch, Khorne, and Slaanesh respectively. The son the Emperor is referring to is Horus, not Sanguinius. And this makes him super pissed. He knows that the Emperor didn't care to hear one single word he uttered, wasn't paying attention, and was communicating directly with the gods from which he was drawing his immeasurable power. And they start fighting. After a very long, very uncomfortable reunion. To say that it was an epic fight is a massive understatement. I do not know if such an event has ever adequately, until now, been put down on paper before. It would be epic, legendary, a saga for the ages if it took place in our one singular reality. But this fight, the final showdown between evil and eviler, between Chaos Ascended Warmaster, traitor, heretic, Horus Lupercal, and the Master of Mankind, Neoth, the New Man, Big E himself, the Truth and the Light, Space Daddy Super Jesus Alexander the Greatest Ever, yeah, it got crazy across all space and time, across an infinity of realities. And it took place physically as well. It got really insane, and 1,000 dominoes had to line up just perfectly. Dominoes that were not anywhere near under the Emperor's control for the Master of Mankind to prevail. The beating that they both took was on the same level as the beating that Sanguinius took from Horus only moments before. I mean, it got bad. It cut to the bone. They were both dealt the kinds of wounds from which there is no recovery. Physical wounds, psychic wounds, and worst of all, emotional wounds. It got psychedelic and crazy when Horus was bringing down Worldbreaker in an attempt to smash the Emperor and literally crush his head. And the Emperor didn't block with his sword, but with an entire alternate reality. Their fight takes place through multiple dimensions, across countless worlds and battlefields, across infinite memories of the wars they waged across the stars to forge the Imperium in tidal waves of blood. The Emperor blocks Horus's death blow with his own treachery, bringing him right to Istvan, to the original treachery. And Horus takes it to Molech and calls out the Emperor's hypocrisy. But the Emperor is on the back foot the entire time. He shed the mantle of godhood, and Horus, ever deluded by his own self-aggrandizement, thinks he has ascended to godhood himself. Horus, in his hubris, thinks himself the equal of Khorne and Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Tzeentch. He thinks they have made him the fifth god, the Dark King, because he was such a swell guy. He's fallen that far into his own worst weakness, his narcissism. Without that, Horus would have been incorruptible. But Chaos exploited him where they could, and that was the weak link in the chain that was Horus, the chink in the armor. And it took everything for the Emperor to prevail. He had to literally and figuratively die, and pull some seriously underhanded moves. But at one point he's nearly unconscious. He's battered and broken and even physically shattered, still barely clinging to life, yet his will keeps him standing. He can't even speak. And Horus, still wanting to bloviate, still wanting to opine about how awesome he is and how righteous his cause is. He's literally talking to the Emperor as he's killing him, as if his father is a fan of what he's doing. He's so deluded. But he won't shut up and wants to talk all that trash before bringing his maul down on his father to end it all, and Big E leans against him, falling into his son's chest. And Horus thinks it's pathetic, and all his father can do, but Big E is literally low-key leeching power from Horus, like a mosquito, vampirically sucking power from his son. And when Horus realizes it, the Emperor has already gained just enough power to renew the fight. And Horus calls him out. He's like, "Dad, you're a basehead for the warp, a warpaholic. And you want to ground me for being one too?" So they keep fighting, and the Emperor gets wounded so horribly that he's bleeding his perpetuality. He's bleeding centuries of time, of life force, of vitality. He's literally bleeding his immortality across all space-time. And the Emperor is constantly on the back foot during the fight, or fights, as there are countless parallel fights across infinite realities going on. He has to use every trick, every move, everything he knows to hang with Horus. But Horus is a bit deluded, thinking he's all that, and forgetting that the gifts the gods gave him are not his natural state. The Emperor does not forget this and knows it's his only chance. And at one point, Big E has Horus on his knees, about to deliver the killing blow, very similar to Sanguinius. And Horus heals. He was mortally wounded many times over, and yet heals. The gods are truly favoring Horus. But some key things happen, mostly involving those who were with the Emperor, namely the Custodes, Proconsul Caecaltus Dusk, Garviel Loken, Leto, and the Perpetuals Olanius Person and John Grammaticus. They deserve their own videos, and we'll get them, but some of the things they did were so tied to the fate of the galaxy, the Emperor and Horus, they have to be mentioned. So Horus obliterates Dusk, who sacrifices himself to save the Emperor at one point. He had survived the Emperor's destruction of the corrupted Custodes due to the sigillite magic symbol that Malcador, the hero, had drawn upon his breastplate. But Horus, shooting a beam of pure bloodlight out of the eye on his own breastplate, disintegrated Dusk entirely, and it is hinted that it was across all dimensions and in the warp. Horus erased Dusk's soul entirely. The heroism of the companions of the Emperor, and to a lesser extent Horus as well, with Abaddon and the Justarin and the Mournival, it is all over the top in this book. It gets to near Sanguinius levels of selfless sacrifice and for the Emperor-ing. How Dan Abnett made it so that we feel for even Abaddon and respect his point of view even if we don't agree with it, but also sets the stage for it to be perfectly fine if we do. It's writing on a level that is just insane. Horus flings Leto into the Chaos Realm, and he literally is there, before the gods themselves, the Big Four. And he's so small and insignificant compared to them, that he thinks that he may be perceiving part of one's claw. But the nail of that claw is kilometers high, reaching into the sky, and he's like a speck of dust to it. His eyes cannot take in the full scale of them, but he knows they're there. Old Person, Olanius Person, appears and gives the Emperor the Anathame blade, but steps in front of Horus and buys the Emperor a moment, and Horus ends him too, supposedly a final end for the oldest human perpetual known in the setting. Horus has the Emperor nailed to his throne in the Lupercal court, impaled several times over with giant shurikens that the Emperor was using against Horus, conjured during one of Big E's big comebacks. I mean, this was a super back and forth, knockdown, drag out fight, and only because of two reasons. First, the Emperor is smarter and more experienced than Horus, and is seeing clearly. But second, Horus just wants to prolong it a bit, as he literally cares more about imparting his feelings to his father, and his justifications, however delusional they are. Saying his piece and aggrandizing himself is almost more important to him than victory. He does try to convince the Emperor to come to his side and rule along with him, which is kind of a reverse Darth Vader move. I appreciated that for what it was. But Horus cannot sway the Emperor, so he mentions Moloch and blocks with a reality shift of his own. And we get a little peek behind the curtain at the deal the Emperor made with the Chaos Gods. The Emperor is actually wounded by this. But yeah, eventually he's nailed to a chair several times over, his head is bashed, his eye melted out, his armor rent, arm shattered, back broken. The Emperor was made to suffer as bad as Sanguinius. Eventually he makes it off his chair, and if I remember correctly, this happened when Caecaltus Dusk was protecting the Emperor from Horus, literally being melted by the bloodlight. And they fight some more, but Horus brings Worldbreaker down and crushes the Emperor's skull. The old man is lying there looking dead. I mean, everyone thinks he's dead. And Horus starts bloviating again about how it was justified and how his rule will be different. But Big E is not dead. He's mentally projecting to be Garviel Loken, the son of Horus and member of the Mournival. And he's telling Horus that he must now shed the dark aspect he's taken on, that he hasn't fully killed his father yet, and he must do so as a Primarch, not as a god. And I put God in air quotes here, but he's playing into Horus's vanity, his ego. And then he asks if Horus is going to rule the Imperium going forward as the man, the Primarch Horus, or as the god, the Dark King Horus. Eventually Horus's own ego can't let it go. And he decides to go smash the Emperor's skull to pulp in a very unceremonious, unheroic, boring in his own eyes way, but as himself. Horus cast off the power the gods had swollen him with and stood before his father as the man who had conquered the galaxy on his behalf. This all plays out to let us know that Big E played him hard and had been reclaiming power, healing himself enough to fight Horus one last time, but had convinced Horus to throw away all the power he'd had, so Big E was finally stronger. And he gets wrecked, taking out his son. Ruined. Absolutely destroyed. Horus pierces his throat with the Talon of Horus, smashes him with the Maul Worldbreaker. Horus is still a beast without the powers of the gods, but they realize his folly and hold back, refusing their power to him as punishment for casting it away, for daring to ever think he was his own man, even their equal. They want Horus to know he is a thrall. The Emperor shoves the anathema dagger into Horus's heart. As Horus sees the truth of what he's become, and that he cannot be trusted as he's obviously very corruptible, he begs his father to end it now, even as the Chaos Gods scrambled to flood their power back into Horus. The Emperor had the smallest window to end his son. And this is where the lore changed massively. He forgives Horus and tells him he will see him again. So now Horus is returnable to the setting. He's just killed, not obliterated utterly in the warp, which is a total role reversal with Sanguinius, who is now gone for good. Total oblivion, apparently. Big E hits Horus with so much psychic power that it detonates brighter than a supernova, and it just melts Horus. He boils the eyes out of Horus's head and melts the flesh off of his face. By the time that Rogel Dorn and Constantine Valdor arrive, Horus is just a dead shell on the floor, steaming and sizzling, reeking the place up with his smoldering flesh. Dorn thinks the Emperor is dead at first, but he finds Dusk's armor remains on the floor, and near it is a tarot card. Valdor and Dorn fight a bit over it at first, but Dorn declares that Litu, who has returned from the realm of chaos, is right, and Litu was insisting that the Emperor was trying to communicate with them in the only way he could. He was speaking through the tarot. Dorn thought the tarot was sorcerous and held it in contempt, as it had freaked him out badly earlier when Malgador had shown him the future using the tarot and it came to pass. But he did know that the Emperor was into the tarot, and so was Malgador, and in his grief, Dorn declared that he could clearly read what the Emperor wanted from him. So he took his dad's body back to Terra and put him on the Golden Throne. The last thing that happened before the Emperor was interred was Malgador was removed from it, and he turned to dust. We get to see Malgador's thoughts on this, and he knows that the Emperor thought he'd failed and deserved the throne as his penance for failing mankind. But Malgador reveals the dark truth right before he dies. The Emperor is in for infinite suffering and agony on that throne. Pure and total horror. Malgador calls it the Throne of Terror. Every single moment is like an infinity of pain, and time is meaningless. 10,000 years later, the Emperor is still in that pain. Thousands of psychers a day are sacrificed to him and the throne, as he drinks their souls like a star vampire, all to sustain his physical form that he cannot heal. Just to keep the light of the Astronomicon lit and warp travel possible for the Imperium of Man, and to remain tethered to the physical world, as that masks his presence in the warp and protects him from the Chaos Gods. But the throne is now failing. The Emperor is slowly dying. His body is failing even as his soul grows in power in the warp. Face to face with his father for the first time in 10,000 years, Guilliman met with a being that was shattered into innumerable pieces of consciousness, as the agony of infinite torture has eroded the center, the grounding point for his father's sanity. He's called both son and also nothing but a tool by the Emperor, and he is called both traitor and the only salvation of mankind as well. Literally, the Emperor calls Rabute Guilliman his last hope, the last hope for the Imperium. And we see that the Emperor is crazy now, or what is left of him. The mind of the Emperor seems shattered into millions of pieces, constantly dealing with the agony of his existence. His body is a wrecked husk that needs to vampirically feed upon psychers and swallow their souls for sustenance, and his soul is a warp god essentially, having grown to rival even the Big Four. And we see that when Big E resurrected Guilliman from Mortarian's godblight and torched the Garden of Nurgle, wounding the Chaos God himself, just how far Big E has come. Sometimes the Emperor is totally lucid and seems cohesive. Sometimes he's totally insane, and sometimes he isn't even available or there at all. But when he does intervene, it can be incredible, and it can turn the tide, even if his servants don't see why his will is the right path. Like when he tells Saint Celestine directly to let Cassar and the Unsung go, an Alpha Legion warband. It was better for mankind that Cassar and the Unsung escape with the beacon than to let it fall into the hands of the followers of the Blood God Khorne, as the World Eaters are not really known for being the best guys out there, or having good intentions for people, to put it mildly. And because it is the Emperor's will, Saint Celestine fights Karn the Betrayer in melee combat to allow Cassar's escape. And it is crazy how much violence Karn does to Celestine. I mean, he butchers her Gemini bodyguard like nothing, and chops her head right off with his chain axe. And Celestine is good with that, knowing that she's dying to let what the Emperor commanded her to allow to come to pass, to actually come to pass. Her life is secondary. But Celestine is an Imperial saint and has the Emperor's attention in ways that others do not. Still, the Emperor will not last on the throne. Everything in the lore is leading to that. But remember when he threw off the mantle of the Dark King, he had to cast off his compassion and his goodness. He had to meet Horus without any weakness that Horus could exploit. And still, Horus found Molech was a sore spot and crushed the Emperor's ego by bringing it up. But that shard of the Emperor is still out there still. And apparently it is responsible for some of the actions attributed to the Emperor. This aspect of his soul is theorized to return, born anew when the Emperor's body finally gives out and he fully dies. The Star Child will be born, or so the prophecy goes. What the Emperor is now, whether it be God, man, or everything in between, he's fighting the good fight on behalf of humanity, day in and day out. He's been tortured, physically, psychically, and emotionally, for 100 centuries, nonstop. And if his agony were to cease for even a moment, then countless souls would perish. Juxtaposed with that, he's the star vampire, the soul sucker, the worst horror imaginable, that consumes the very souls of thousands of the most gifted humans that ever existed every single day. Untold billions have perished to slake the Emperor's thirst over the millennia, each one sacrificed in extreme cosmic horror as their soul is consumed and ultimately just absorbed into the greater homogenized soul soup the Emperor is composed of. You sustain his body and empower his will, but you lose all individuality. Your essence for eternity is absorbed and merged with his own. In just as many ways as the Emperor is the savior of humanity and all that is holding the Imperium together, he is also parasiting off of it. He's the curse that is our salvation, the darkness that is the light. Now here's where we go into a bit of speculation and maybe even conspiratorial thinking. But I for one think he's coming back, as in getting up off the throne and manifesting physically and in perfect health again. I do believe that he may have to die to do this, but it was strongly hinted that Dorne believed the Emperor would never heal from his wounds, that whatever Horus had done seems to be permanent, which was much of his justification for putting his father on the throne. But what if Dorne is wrong? That's one possibility, that the Emperor would have healed by now if only he wasn't enslaved by the throne that is literally sucking his essence away psychically, even as it sustains the husk of his physical form. He's been crying out in perpetual pain for 10,000 years, just trying to hold on, when he'd have been fine if they would have just gotten him off that chair. Or others speculate that he must die for the Star Child to be reborn, that his perpetuality is unknown to his sons and the Imperium in general, so slaying him would be the right move, as it would allow him to reincarnate. But Dorne, again, believed that the Emperor's wounds were not just something he would ever be able to heal from, and he didn't know of the perpetual nature of the Emperor. It was a case of the Praetor of Terra thinking he was doing the right thing, but his father's defeat and near death did completely crush him. Dorn was a broken man. So with this third part of my series on the Emperor concluded, we've seen his lore as it goes from birth to his internment on the Golden Throne in his perpetual near-death state of immeasurable agony. What do you all think? Will Games Workshop and Black Library return the Emperor to the setting of Warhammer 40,000? Can they do it in a way that makes sense? I think they will. Warhammer 40K is about to turn 40 years old, and with the delay of Pandemonium on purpose, it seems they are aligning all the pieces, setting the board for the ultimate narrative yet. Mark my words, 2 years from now, we'll have every Primarch back in the setting, and Big E will hit the tabletop with a glorious new model. And who knows, maybe if they do, the narrative surrounding it won't suck, and will actually serve to push this setting harder, further, into the grimdark. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but one thing we can't deny, things are getting crazy for sure.